Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, I'm joined by former MI6 officer turned author Charles Beaumont, and we discuss the factual influences behind his new novel, A Spy Alone. Please note that at Charles's request, I've had to disguise his voice. I hope that doesn't detract from our conversation. Just before we begin, if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider supporting us directly by becoming a Patreon subscriber. All you need to do is just go to patreon.com/secrets and spies. And depending on which level you pick, you'll get a free coaster or coffee cup. And also you'll get access to our Patreon exclusive show, Extra Shot, which comes out twice a month after every espresso martini. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Charles, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you on. Now, you are our first ever guest who's worked in the past for MI6, which is quite an amazing thing. So thank you for joining us today.
Well, it's great to be here.
Excellent. Now, is there anything you can tell us about yourself before we kind of go into the main body of the interview?
Probably not an enormous amount about my professional background, but as is going to be obvious, I'm British. I've got that background. I worked in government service, worked overseas in various places, and then more recently I've taken to writing fiction.
Excellent. And you've done an amazing job. Your book, I guess, with your experience and stuff, it just sort of really has that nice sort of feeling of peeking behind the secret curtain, which is always the thing that I'm craving from novels, which is a bit of a rarity. So it's nice to have that.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted you've enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I suppose one question, I don't know again if you can answer this one. What was it that inspired you to sort of join MI6?
To be honest with you, I think it was more a case of the opportunity became available, and as you might imagine, I was pretty intrigued by what it might involve. And it's obviously a fascinating, varied, challenging, complicated job, but it was one that I was very, very excited to be able to do.
Excellent. Just to tip into some of your expertise, would you be able to give us just a brief overview of what the different intelligence services in Britain do and how they work with the Joint Intelligence Committee?
Definitely, yeah. So in Britain, there are 3 intelligence agencies, and the first thing to know about them is that they're all civilian organisations, so these are not anything to do with the military. Of course, they cooperate with them, but they're civilian organisations. You've got the Security Service, which is known as MI5, and that deals with domestic security issues. In the past, they did a lot of work on counter-terrorism, particularly, you can imagine the time of 7/7 and those sorts of attacks on, tube attacks and so on. But historically, they were very focused on dealing with external espionage. So you can imagine in the Cold War, sort of Russian espionage in this country. And I suspect that's become much more of a focus, in the present day as well, given what's happening in the world. So that's MI5. MI6 is an organisation whose job it is to collect intelligence overseas, to work internationally. And again, it is a civilian organisation, and it operates in various places around the world, and it tends to focus on human intelligence. So that means, some people have this term HUMINT, and that means sources who are people who have access to information, who are sharing that information with with the British government for whatever reason that might be. And again, that information is collected in order to help our leaders, politicians and so on make the right decisions. And then finally, GCHQ, the famous signals intelligence agency, and so that is very much in the business of collecting information that is sort of out there in the ether, whether it's electronic or radio or some kind of sort of computer type data. So those are the three UK intelligence agencies, and then you mentioned the Joint Intelligence Committee. Now that is a body that sits at the heart of Whitehall, and its job is to kind of fuse the different intelligence from these agencies, because if you're a minister, a cabinet minister, or even a prime minister, you're obviously not going to have time to read individual intelligence reports from a single source. What you need is a kind of fusion of different intel sources into an overall assessment, something that perhaps helps you understand the big picture. And so that's the work of the Joint Intelligence Committee. And then the committee itself has high senior members of the sort of public service who assess these reports and sort of try to make judgments and give advice. So hopefully that gives you an overview.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. So let's have a quick look at your novel. Can you just give us a sort of brief summary of what your novel is about and why you chose to write it?
Yeah. So what I've done with this novel is I've taken the historic Cold War idea of the Cambridge spy ring. People will be familiar with the people such as Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, and so on. And these were young men. This is, in real history, young men in the 1930s passed through Cambridge University and were recruited as fervent communists, ideological communists, to report to Russian intelligence. But because they were all men of a certain sort of background and class, they ended up having quite high positions in British society. Kim Philby was in MI6. You had others who were in the Foreign Office and in other roles, and they remained undiscovered for decades. So that's the historical context. What I wanted to do in my novel was to see if such a concept could exist in our modern era. And obviously, we're in an era where the idea of sort of working for Russia because of communism or because of your belief in Russian values seems very improbable. But perhaps there could be other reasons that people might seek to cooperate with the Russian state. So I set this spy ring originally in Oxford University, just to sort of contrast a little, and it begins in the 1990s, so very much a post-Cold War era, and it tries to follow a similar trajectory that there is a group of people who have gone through that sort of elite educational institution and then ended up in high positions in British society today. And the novel, most of the action of the novel takes place in right now in the contemporary era.
Yeah. And one of the interesting differences between the Cambridge spy ring and the one that you've sort of created, and I hope it's not a major spoiler, there's sort of a slight right-wing twist to it, or rather than it being left-wing inspired.
Yeah, and I think that reflects on the contemporary politics of Russia. Russia has become a nationalist, socially conservative, kind of sovereigntist country that is obsessed with its power, with its military power, with its sense of its own sort of right to dominate its neighbours. And obviously, particularly with the case of Ukraine, we're seeing that unfolding at the moment. And what you see this in real life, setting aside my novel for a moment, in real life at the moment, you do see that certain figures on the right, not necessarily in Britain, but certainly in Europe and America, North America, will sometimes publicly be supportive of Russia. We've seen that with the National Front in France. We've seen it with some of the people in the US Congress who seem not remotely interested in supporting and defending Ukraine. We've seen it in other countries. And so yes, rather than this being a kind of leftist Marxist idea, it's somehow drifted into the territory of sort of right-wing nationalism.
No, brilliant. Well, I'd like to explore some of the real-world topics that we've kind of already done a little bit there, which is great. So one of the first things, Simon is working in the world of private intelligence. Your protagonist, Simon, he's working in the world of private intelligence. And is it a kind of a common thing these days that former intelligence officers kind of move into the private sector And what kind of things do private intelligence companies do?
Yeah. So thanks for mentioning that. So my protagonist, as you say, Simon
Mm.
Sharman, he's not a serving intelligence officer. He's quite a long time out of the service. And he's in the private sector. And I took that decision because I wanted to situate this book in a world that is very familiar. London is the global capital of private intelligence. Some people call it corporate intelligence. And to answer your question directly, quite a lot of former intelligence officers work in this sector. And what they tend to do is provide information to businesses, to private clients that might be hard to access. So a case study might be perhaps a private bank is considering taking on a new client. Maybe it's an ultra wealthy individual, could be a member of a royal family somewhere or a billionaire, and they want to ascertain whether or not that individual's wealth presents a reputational risk or possibly even a money laundering risk or some kind of other compliance risk. And so private intelligence businesses will provide a sort of enhanced due diligence. They'll do an analysis of that client and their background and maybe, have a look at how they got their wealth and so on. So that's a sort of one example. Another example might be more in the kind of political information space. So you could imagine a business planning to set up a new joint venture in a country where perhaps the politics are quite unpredictable. Perhaps it's a sort of emerging market in the Middle East or Africa or something like that. And you might seek to get a sense of the political environment and what the chances are of, policies changing that would go against you and that sort of thing. And then the final area is the sort of investigative work. So private intelligence is sometimes called private investigations, and that might be about, money that's gone missing or a fraud or a dispute over the ownership of some asset and that sort of thing. So those are some sort of case studies of the work that exists in this sector. And as I mentioned, London is very much a global hub for this sort of work.
What's interesting as well, like with the character of Simon, he has this sort of Raymond Chandler, kind of Philip Marlowe cynicism a bit about the sort of world he's in now. He sort of talks a little bit about how some former sort of spooks or kind of colleagues of his have sort of worked for Russians and people in the private intelligence and may have even undermined the very country that they were once working for.
Yeah. And that is sadly definitely something that's happened in the real world. You look at that there have been case studies of Russian oligarchs who've since the Ukraine war been sanctioned. So we shouldn't be in any doubt about, what they're up to and how close they were to Putin. And those people have been able to hire businesses in London to, snoop on their opponents. In one notorious case, I think a British journalist's home address was looked up and released by one of these companies. So that's that seems to be an issue.
How important is sort of human intelligence today versus sort of signals intelligence and other methods? And is human intelligence still even relevant or even possible? Because we're now moving into this world of sort of AI enhanced digital surveillance. We've got biotechnology. I mean, it's very difficult probably to fake a passport these days and so on.
Yeah, that's a good point. Certainly, the sort of bio data or the personal data. Almost everybody, certainly in the kind of Western world, anybody who lives any kind of online life, you couldn't pretend to be someone else for very long. You even if you keep off social media yourself, your face will have been photographed at numerous borders and all that kind of thing. So I certainly think elements of that world have changed significantly. But ultimately, if you think about what human intelligence is, it's about one person having knowledge of a certain thing and sharing that knowledge with another person. And in that very simple context, it's not hard to imagine cases where a human may be the only person who can have access to certain information. So if you think of a big political question, let's say the date of the general election in Britain this year. Now, It may be that Rishi Sunak doesn't know, but let's say he knows and he's only told one person, and that one person has kept that information to themselves. That's a great example of where human intelligence, I'm not for a moment suggesting this would happen, but if you had hacked into his computer or hacked into his phone, you might not find any information at all that lets you know that. But actually, if you had somebody who'd had a conversation with Rishi Sunak and had confirmed that they were planning, I don't know, let's say they're planning the election in October and they've picked a date, but they haven't shared that with anyone. That's an example of where human still has a role to play. So I think, whilst certainly the way in which so much of our lives is now effectively an online digital life, that has changed intelligence, but it hasn't ended the validity of certain types of intelligence.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it gives you an insight into intent as well, because like, I don't know, should a country suddenly have a whole lot of new nuclear weapons, we want to know what they want to do with it, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, or if you take the example of the Ukraine war,
Mm.
I would imagine that a huge question which probably could only be answered, and to be clear to any listener, I'm not saying I know the answer, but the only answer probably could come from human intelligence, would be what Vladimir Putin sees as his own bottom line.
Yeah.
Because, I doubt he really thinks he's going to wipe Ukraine off the map. I mean, obviously they might talk about that publicly, but the attempt to seize Kyiv right at the beginning of the war failed. And as we both know, there's a bit of a stalemate there in the sort of Donbass region. So what's he hoping for? Does he want to draw a line roughly where the front line is now and force Ukraine to accept that? Does he have ambitions to push back, further into Ukraine? Or maybe he does maintain ambitions to take Kyiv, but that's the sort of thing that probably it isn't written down anywhere, because ultimately it's something that if he were to communicate that widely, of course, it would shape the way that other people dealt with him.
Yeah.
So it's questions that can only be answered by somebody who's in the know remain very important questions often.
Yeah, definitely. And how does an intelligence officer kind of go about recruiting an asset to spy for them? Because it's quite an interesting and complex relationship.
Absolutely. In the book, I write obviously it's a completely fictional case study, but somebody who has a relationship with British intelligence over the years, a Russian asset, who then sort of falls out with British intelligence, and that happens to some extent because he sees sort of pride and kind of national. He sees pride in the way that Russia has sort of regained its sense of kind of national status, whereas of course most people in the world see that as a threat, and in my view rightly so. But you could imagine a situation where somebody in the chaotic Russia of the early 90s felt that perhaps cooperating with a foreign government was helping Russia to sort of establish its sort of future and sort of get back on track. Whereas maybe that person nowadays would say that Russia is now being sort of taken down and sort of held back by hostile powers. So to answer your question more directly, people's motivations, as you say, are very complex. Sometimes people want money. Sometimes people have an ideological reason. Perhaps they feel profoundly opposed to what their own country is doing. Sometimes perhaps it is a desire to have great influence, that you could imagine someone who in their own system is perhaps doesn't have much influence over their hierarchy, but through being an intelligence source for another country, by being an intelligence source for another country, is able to impact the leadership and the decisions that are made by that leadership. So a lot, human motivation, just as in any other walk of life, is very complex and unique. And in a way, I think that's why it makes quite a good subject for novels, because the reasons that people do things are buried in the complexity of their characters.
Yeah, definitely. From a lot of sort of Cold War history I've read, a lot of Russian spies work for the West. Some of them tended to either be sort of a bit disgruntled because they'd been passed up for a promotion, or
Yeah.
over time, like with Oleg Gordievsky, they kind of became disgusted with the direction Russia had gone in, and sort of fell out with the ideology of Russia. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think during the Cold War, you saw what might be called a sort of classic motivation, which is very ideological, because um, it would be hard to imagine that you would take that level of risk, particularly for a Russian. Almost all Russians who were caught spying ended up being executed during the
Yeah.
Cold War,
Yeah.
and probably, horribly tortured and all the rest of it. So if you were willing to take that level of risk, you probably wouldn't be doing it for sort of short-term, desire just to get rich or something like that. You'd have to have a very fundamental ideological reason. But as you say, the sort of disgruntlement, people who feel that their talents and insight haven't been sufficiently recognised, but perhaps they feel that they're being recognised in this other way. And it comes back to that idea I had, that you could feel that you can have influence via intelligence on another country, and that can be quite a powerful motivator, I think.
Yeah, people want to feel important, don't they?
Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed.
Yeah, and especially I think middle-aged men sometimes get to this point where they feel like, oh my goodness, I've got no influence, no anything. Maybe I'm speaking for myself here. And suddenly, like, being an international spy, it just sounds like, wow,
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's absolutely right, and I genuinely, I don't know the answer to this, but I wouldn't be surprised if quite a lot of intelligence sources all over the world are middle-aged men. That wouldn't be shocking if we learned that.
Yeah. No, indeed. But they certainly read a lot of the spy books out there.
Right.
So.
Yes.
So something there in that. So the one thing I do find fascinating, is that relationship between the intelligence officer and their asset. I've even made a short film about that. And there's this sort of bond of trust that's required in that relationship, but it's sort of in a world of deception where you can't really trust anybody.
Yes.
So I suppose, how do you know if someone's actually being honest once you've recruited them?
Well, that's a great question, and the answer might be you don't. If we take a very famous and publicly avowed case study is the Iraq WMD intelligence. Now, obviously, a lot of that turned out to be incorrect, turned out to be made up, basically, and it appears that the sources of that intelligence perhaps were telling their case officer what they wanted to hear, probably being paid handsomely for it, and clearly initially at least, the ability to work out that these people were making it up did not come through. Now, of course, there are things that are done. The Americans make use of a polygraph, lie detector tests, quite wide use of that. Obviously, one of the best ways is to get a level of corroboration. So if you receive an intelligence report from a certain source, and then let's say there are three other sources, all of which in a different way, maybe one is another human source but not connected, maybe the other one is, signals intelligence or imagery, or who knows. If you can triangulate, then clearly that's a very good validation. Another thing, if someone says, I don't know, I work in the office of the Ministry of Defence, and they can produce documents that clearly come from that office, that again is a way of sort of validating what they do. So there are different ways, but undoubtedly you don't know. And as you say, that one of the challenges with intelligence is that the whole relationship is based in deception. It's by definition you're asking the source to do something, and you're asking them not to tell anyone else, because you're trying to protect them. You don't want them to be exposed. But you're in this scenario where everyone is lying to everyone about something, and of course, all human relationships, and it's something I have in the novel. All human relationships have layers of deception in them. Even the best, most trusting and honest, partnership, that it still has layers of deception. Maybe it's just the deception of someone saying, "Oh, you do look lovely," when maybe they don't quite. But we all do this, and so I think managing the layers of deception and trying to get at an underlying truth is basically the sort of biggest challenge of human intelligence.
The book opens on a great counter-surveillance scene in which Simon spots a tail. Can you talk to us a bit about the art of counter-surveillance and why it's important for an intelligence officer to use it before meeting a source?
Yeah, so the basic thing is that if you're meeting a source or doing something else and you don't want to be observed, obviously you need to make sure that you aren't being observed. And in particular, somebody who might be working in a hostile environment, where you don't control the ground. So maybe you're in a foreign country, or maybe you're in a city that is, controlled by a hostile criminal group or something. You can't just sort of rely on the police or some other colleagues or something to sort of control the setting. So that's the basic concept of anti-surveillance, of checking to see if you're being tailed. The way in which it's done in the end is relatively intuitive, in the sense that you do have to look around you. You do have to see if you've spotted someone. You do have to see if you see that person a second time. You have to see if that person's behaviour is not illogical or in some other way suspicious. But obviously you want to do that in a way that doesn't draw attention to yourself. So you must appear to be natural at all times. So in a way, that's the big tension, is giving yourself the excuse to sort of look around behind you without just standing in a street and turning round. If you or I was walking down the road and someone ahead of us stopped, turned around and stared at us, we'd immediately think, well, that's pretty weird. But if someone went into a shop for 20 seconds, came back out and looked both ways and then, carried on down the street, that seems quite normal behaviour. So it's those sorts of things. It's almost like a kind of acting where you're behaving in a certain way, in order to appear natural, whilst using that to give yourself the opportunity to take a look at what's happening around you.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating area. So I many years ago made a short film. It's called The Dry Cleaner. That's all about. It opens with this sort of anti-surveillance scene, and I got the idea from a couple of books. One of them, Oleg Gordievsky's book, and I've always found it such a fascinating thing. And I liked your note in your book about the people who are following you. You might be able to change their clothes, but they probably won't be able to change their shoes.
Right. Yeah. So that's like, so I had that sort of in the opening sequence, and this idea that, of course, someone can put on a cap or a wig or change their coat. And of course, these days, something that occurred to me recently, it's become not that abnormal to wear a face mask. Now, a few years ago, someone wearing a face mask was a really odd, that stood out. Whereas now, a bit less common than it was 2 years ago, but you don't immediately think, well, that's suspicious behaviour. You just think that's somebody who's got good reason to safeguard their health. So now, of course, that makes it very hard to recognise, So I think there are lots of ways in which the evolution of social norms affects this very sort of basic activity.
No, indeed. And I imagine as well now, if you're in a country with really good CCTV, it must make it harder as well for the intelligence officer when doing their sort of dry cleaning drills and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're being very honest, this is quite a sort of traditional activity, and in the modern era, a combination of CCTV and mobile phones, which are broadcast our location constantly. Now, obviously, you don't have to have a mobile phone on you. You can go to places where there isn't CCTV, so that it may not be impossible, but it's definitely that the challenges are getting much harder. And the other thing is drone technology. It's very easy for someone to put a drone up in the air, which has extraordinary quality of imagery. Now, you might not get away with doing that in the centre of a busy town, but you can imagine that there's a lot of ways in which it gets harder for the individual to disappear, compared with perhaps 50 years ago.
Yeah, indeed. And there's quite a fun show on Channel 4 called Hunted, where they follow members of the public and they show like the drones being used and all that kind of stuff. So it gives you a taste of how difficult it is these days. So,
Yeah, indeed. I think that's a great show because it makes you stop and think, in a normal day, how many times do I do something where, without choosing to, I communicate where I am and what I'm doing to maybe hundreds of people who I don't know who they are. I swipe my card, I do contactless, I do something online, which is a website that knows my location because it needs to function and all that stuff. And of course, that is how we now live our lives. And so, um, if you have a reason not to want to share that knowledge, clearly you have to think very hard about more than just where am I standing right now, but all kinds of other elements of what you're doing.
Indeed. Well, thank you for that. Well, let's take a quick break and then we'll be right back. So your book sort of touches on this interesting topic of rich Russian oligarchs who enjoy the trappings of life in the UK and the use of the legal and financial system to their advantage. What was sort of your inspiration for that?
Well, I think that has been a feature of British public life. It's been a feature of the political debate in our country. And I certainly think up until the start of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, it was really an unaddressed question.
Yeah.
There was the famous Russia report from the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee, which, as I'm sure your listeners, given their interest, will be aware, was sort of sat on for some time. It wasn't released. There was a debate about whether or not that was because the government found it embarrassing. And there's been this big question of the ease with which certain Russians who appear to be very close to the leadership, very close to Vladimir Putin, may even be part of the leadership. They could own multi-million-dollar properties in London. They could use the London banking system to sort of launder their money, all those sorts of things. So it seemed to me that was a kind of serious issue and a very contemporary issue that I felt was sort of worth addressing in the fiction genre, because it allows you to sort of explore it in a fairly entertaining way.
And what I like about that as well, it's grounded because of your knowledge, because I think with authors who don't necessarily have as much real-world experience or have done the research, it can get a bit silly sometimes. I think it's, one of my bugbears in contemporary spy fiction is it usually turns into MI6 or the CIA the ultimate villain, and it's just because people don't really know better, and it's just a bit. I find that a bit lazy now. But
yeah, I agree with you that sort of. I find it tends to be more on the screen, but there's always in the last episode you find out that the conspiracy is at home. And now I won't give away the spoiler for my book. There is cynicism and conspiracy, but it's not of that nature. And I feel that actually in a way, there is something more insidious, which is the normalization of certain types of economic activity, which has allowed, in my view, a sort of degradation of our kind of public life, and has had lots of unintended consequences, of course. And in a way, trying to understand that seems like a more important thing than the idea that there's a sort of deep state inside job always going on.
Indeed, and I think with what you present in your book, it seems more plausible, and it reminds me of, I think, some of the work of Luke Harding at The Guardian as well. It certainly sort of ties in sort of nicely with all those sort of things there.
Yeah, he's a great journalist. He also was very complimentary about my book, so obviously good. I think he's brilliant.
Excellent. So it's been reported that Russian espionage efforts today are more prolific than maybe even during the Cold War. Are things that bad?
Well, I genuinely not going to pretend I have the inside track, and it is important to, I've obviously got a background in those organisations, but I haven't been in them recently, and I'm not. But the book is a work of fiction. It doesn't contain any state secrets, and it couldn't be published if it did. But I think, if you think about the sort of public reporting that we see lots of reports of Russian online espionage, of hacks, major hacks, whether it's of software in US government servers or that kind of thing. We also see tends to be in countries where Russia feels less constrained. We see, pretty hardcore sort of GRU, that's Russian military intelligence activity, assassinations, things like that. Let's not forget the assassination of Litvinenko in this country, and then the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal, and possibly other, deaths that I think probably do remain unexplained, and probably at least some of them must be put at Russia's door. And then the political interference, which some remains speculation, but some is not in speculation. It's not in doubt that the Russians loaned money to the French National Front. It's not in doubt that Austrian and Italian sort of right-wing politicians have had very sort of deep relationships with elements of the Russian state, and that there are other case studies we could go on. So I think it's pretty clear, and in a way, perhaps it wouldn't be surprising that this is a country that's allowed itself to become very isolated in terms of its sort of alliances, and increasingly economically isolated. It's pursuing this ruinous war in Ukraine. So in a way, perhaps it's not surprising that they're so heavily involved in espionage, hostile espionage activities.
Yeah, indeed. Are you able to just give us a quick overview of the Russian intelligence services and which agencies sort of operate abroad?
Yeah, okay. So they have the main ones that will be of interest. I think you have as I mentioned, the GRU, which is a military intelligence service, and so the people in that come through the military. They are soldiers, sailors, whatever. But it operates in a variety of ways. Some of what it does is more of a sort of special forces, special operations type work. Other things that it does is more classic intelligence gathering, so, running human sources and so on. That operates both within Russia and overseas. There's a Russian agency called the SVR, which came out of the original KGB, which existed obviously in the Soviet era. The SVR is specifically tasked with overseas intelligence collection. And then you have the FSB, Federal Security Bureau, which is the successor to the old KGB, and that is for the internal security of Russia. But where it gets a bit complicated is that the FSB also has responsibility on former Soviet states. So, for example, very significant in the context of Ukraine, it is widely believed that the FSB provided a series of, as it would turn out, incorrect intelligence to Putin to lead him to believe that Ukraine would collapse very quickly, that there might be a kind of coup, or that, but basically that Zelensky would not stand and fight, but he'd jump in a sort of, car and head for the hills. And there's been very interesting reporting suggesting that actually the FSB was spending millions on sort of suborning Ukrainian officials who would then flip sides to Russia once the invasion began, and either that money was being spent corruptly or misspent. But clearly, we all know that didn't happen in the event.
Yeah, it's interesting, that one, because I think I've read in books where sometimes intelligence officers set up a fake agent and then give them lots of money, and in fact they're pocketing that money.
Yeah, and clearly, Russia's a very, very corrupt country, and the Russian intelligence officers, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them, get very rich. And of course, if you look at Putin's own sort of network, it's based around his own sort of, brothers in arms, as it were. Now, so Putin comes from the FSB. He did work overseas in Germany, but he's effectively a sort of internal security guy. And it's his people that he kind of grew up with in St. Petersburg, who are some of the richest billionaires in Russia. And so this idea that being in the intelligence agencies might make you quite a lot of money is not a crazy idea. Whereas, at the risk of sounding pious, I don't think anyone in the UK or the US thinks that that's a route to wealth, is going in that type of public service.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. My next question is, what kind of cover do Russian intelligence officers use these days? Are they still someone who works for the embassy, or is it a bit more than that now?
Well, I think it's pretty varied. You have to assume that there are plenty working in embassies, but don't forget that there's been quite famous cases of expulsions of Russian intelligence officers. So, for example, after the Skripal poisoning, there was this coordinated wave of expulsions of Russian intelligence officers, obviously from the UK, but from countries all over the world, across Europe, North America, and so on. So what that means is it gets harder. Now, obviously, the Russians might try to send some new intelligence officers to work at the embassy, but it gets harder as this goes on because these people's covers are blown. But there will be Russian intelligence officers working in many different settings. One element actually is the use of these mercenary companies. So the Wagner company, some of those people appear to be intelligence officers. Some of them may just be former soldiers who are working as mercenaries. You see it also in the context of these kind of fake republics in eastern Ukraine, the Luhansk and Donetsk so-called People's Republic, where you have Russian intelligence officers who somehow also have a official position in those governments, or quasi governments. So I think what you see with the Russians is that they're willing to be quite flexible about the way that they deploy people overseas. And of course, the other one is the use of illegals. This is where you have a person who lives for many years a normal life in another country, but that all that time that they are an undercover intelligence officer, and that's something that the Russians have made a bit of a specialism of. There's the great sort of fictional portrayal of this is the TV show The Americans, which obviously it's TV, it's quite dramatic. There's more sex and violence than there probably is in real life, but it's, as a context, you've got this couple. Everyone thinks they're an American couple running a travel agency, and they're also undercover Russian agents, and that's a model that the Russians continue to operate.
Yeah, I don't think they'd get away with the wigs that they use in that show.
No, indeed, it's they managed to be sort of 5 people in one day, and just sort of pulling off the wig, and but yes, they definitely they pack quite a lot in, that couple. They definitely sort of deserve their bonus at the end of the year.
Definitely. Do Russia still use sleeper agents, and could there be some in the UK today?
Well, there have been cases of these agents being uncovered in relatively recent times. I think there was a case, I'm just trying to remember, there was a case in Norway not long ago of someone who was an academic, I think with a Brazilian nationality, but they weren't, they'd started life in Russia, and they'd managed to acquire a new identity in Brazil, and was working, I think, in a sort of defense studies type university department. So if they're in Norway, we shouldn't be complacent and assume that they aren't here as well.
There was a lady in Greece, I think it was 2 years ago, who was selling jewelry or something to some members of NATO or something like that.
Yes,
and she had a Brazilian passport.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that so sometimes they're quite unexpected, because you think of the guy in a defense policy department, that seems sort of predictable, but as you say, sometimes they can be quite unexpected. People might remember, because it's a very sort of glamorous kind of feels like a film movie. The woman called Anna Chapman.
Oh yes.
Who she's now a prominent politician back in Russia, in a sort of Putin's party, has become a sort of very nationalist figure, and this rather sort of glamorous redhead. And she lived as I can't remember what business she was in, but it wasn't something you immediately associate with espionage. She lived in the UK and I think America, with that kind of profile. So yeah, these people could use any number of different guises.
Yeah, indeed. Funny enough, I've always thought photography would be a good cover for an undercover
Right, yeah.
spy.
Yeah, you've
'Cause
got an excuse to
yeah,
go around and
you
take
do.
photos of
You
things, and
do.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's always an interesting one, that one. So, obviously the Russians are recruiting assets. What kind of people are they kind of looking for in the West, do you think?
Well, I think we have to be realistic that they probably find it quite difficult.
Mm,
Obviously, at the moment, uh, there aren't many sort of places where Russia is in high esteem, or if it is in high esteem, it might be with people who have already made a decision to kind of step outside the norms of
mm,
opinion and behavior. And I've mentioned examples of politicians in the West who seem to be quite pro-Russian, but in the main, they tend to be slightly on the fringe. So I think, having said that, I think where Russia seems to be quite effective is in the sort of information operations. So it may be journalists. Now, I wouldn't expect journalists in any kind of credible sort of mainstream publication, but we live in this environment where there's endless websites
mm.
and blogs, and sometimes something that might appear in a fairly fringe publication then finds its way onto a mainstream
Yeah,
website, a Daily
yeah,
Mail or whatever, but
yeah.
the story might have begun off on the fringes. So I think um I imagine most of these recruitments are basically money based. It's basically people doing something and being paid quite a lot of money to do it. It's very hard to imagine a sort of ideological basis, but where there is that ideology in that kind of nationalist, um, sort of populist nationalist element, uh, I think that the argument may be that it's not that we think you agree with us on everything, but you think that our interests are aligned, and you can see that appealing to some people, and maybe almost the people deluding themselves, saying, "No, I'm not supporting Russia, but I'm pursuing my objectives, and they
Mm.
happen to be ones that Russia agrees with."
Yeah. I've always found what I find fascinating about Russia now, and I don't know whether it's people being directly recruited, but you kind of find there's a lot of people, obviously, on the far right, we were talking about earlier, and the right
Yeah.
wing who are very sympathetic, but they also seem to still appeal to these sort of far left people from
Yes.
the past. And I find it such an
Yep.
interesting kind of thing that.
Yeah, some people talk about this sort of horseshoe,
Mm,
where the far left and the far right end up having quite similar
mm,
positions. And in fact, in my book, I mean, I do have one character who's on the far left who is sort of in that space, and there are definitely people, again, whether they're recruited agents or
mm,
maybe they because of their sort of sense of anti-imperialism. I mean, to me, it's very bizarre that someone who thinks that they're an anti-imperialist doesn't recognise that what's happening to Ukraine is an imperial war.
yeah.
But there are people who make that argument all the time, and it's a very convenient argument for Russia, and sometimes you see these, less so since 2022, but you did see these people attend conferences hosted by Russia or funded by Russia, or appear at forums and
Mm.
that sort of thing.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. I think the war in Ukraine has certainly changed things a little bit on that front now, especially with the far left side of things. I think
Yeah, I think it's just removed the room for ambiguity. So where probably cynically in the past people could sort of say, well, I don't necessarily agree with Russia, but it's important that we listen to each other, or you can
Mm.
come up with those kinds of convenient framings, and I think that's very hard to do now.
Yeah, indeed. Well, as we've sort of this has been saying, with the invasion of Ukraine, assassinations abroad, there's even accusations which sadly are contested, but I think are true, of interference in the US elections in
Yep.
2016. It feels like the late 90s optimism towards Russia is very much long gone now. And we're kind of going into a new Cold War. Some people even said Russia sees itself at war with the West, whilst we don't.
Mm.
So I guess, how significant a threat is Russia to the West now at the moment? And do you think there are any hopes things could get better in time? Or
Well, I think that the threat question, I think it is very significant
mm,
because partly because the West is very disunited now. I mean, you mentioned the US, and whether or not Russia did interfere, and my own view, I think the evidence is quite strong. Depending on, you could argue about exactly what they did, but
mm,
the evidence of of a level of interference in 2016 seems very strong. We have a situation now where one of the candidates in the presidential election, Donald Trump, is pretty clear that he sees Russia's side of the argument, particularly on the war in Ukraine, and there are plenty of other Republican politicians who certainly are hostile to the idea of supporting Ukraine. Now, maybe, they will argue this not anything to do with being pro-Russia and it's for other reasons, but the effect is the same. So Russia looks at the West and sees a disunited West. It sees an America that is basically fed up with propping up Europe's security. As listeners will know, the current attempt to get an agreement through Congress to continue to support Ukraine basically has failed. So you then turn to Europe, and Europe it's stood up much better than most people expected. We have to recognise that, so let's not bury ourselves in doom. Germany stepped up in a way that I think very few people predicted. France also. Italy, under a very right-wing government, has actually maintained its sort of commitment to NATO and so on. So this isn't, it's not the end of the world, but Hungary is a problem, Slovakia is a problem. Until recently, you had some complexities in Poland, albeit, very hostile to Russia, but also quite sort of disconnected on elements of Western commitments. So I think Russia feels that it can continue to divide opinion, divide the West. Now, whether Russia has some ambition to, continue its military aggression past Ukraine, I think that's very hard to know. I mean, it's clearly very tied down in Ukraine, but one feels slightly as if the war in Ukraine has forced it into this kind of total war economy, that it can't really do anything else now. It has to carry on its wars. So I think we have to take it very seriously.
Yeah, indeed. What was your reaction to the invasion of Ukraine? Was it a surprise to you, or did you feel it was kind of inevitable?
No, I didn't think it was inevitable. I think it was a surprise. I think, yes, there was a lot of intelligence pointing to it, and I say, that was being briefed publicly. That was a policy to do so. But would he be that stupid? That's the question, because obviously the effect for Russia, the economic impact, the loss of maybe 300,000 young Russian men. But also, let's think about Finland and Sweden joining NATO. I mean, Finland's in, Sweden is getting very close to sort of finishing that. If someone had said to Vladimir Putin in 2021, well, Finland is going to be in NATO fairly soon, I mean, that would have been enough to make him threaten nuclear war. And so there were so many reasons for Putin not to do it that I think it was still quite shocking when it happened.
Yeah. I remember the build up to it, and it was that whole will he, won't he thing. Yeah, and it was just, I don't know, I cynically sort of feel like he's going to do it, isn't he? And he sadly did. So it's, yeah.
I think one element of that story is the way he did it, because he did this big build up of troops, but it wasn't the build up that you'd really need to invade a vast country like Ukraine, and that was subsequently proved. Now, of course, the theory may be that he didn't think that he'd need to fight his way to Kyiv, that this thing I was talking about earlier, the FSB sort of plot, that the government would sort of collapse in on itself. So there are lots of elements of this where we're trying to understand his calculation, which I think are probably we're still slightly in the realm of speculation.
Yeah, and just thinking the Wagner mutiny last year, of his mutiny, showed it was a lot easier to get to Moscow than it was to Kyiv.
Well, right. I mean, and that remains an extraordinary story, doesn't it? That they, on one level, it seems barely credible that this really rather tiny force could seriously be headed to Moscow. But until it was Prigozhin who called the halt. He wasn't fought to a standstill. So very, very fascinating little episode.
Yeah, my theory's been I don't think Prigozhin ever intended to win. I don't think he thought he would get as far as he did. That's why he had to bring it to a stop, but it didn't end
Yeah.
well for him in the end, did it?
Well, indeed, and it's sort of he must have quite quickly.
Mm,
I mean, I think he was obviously a hothead, but he must have quite quickly thought, "Hang on, I haven't got much of a de-escalation plan here."
no.
You know, it as you say, it didn't end well for him.
No. I do wonder if that was his final thought on the planes that was tumbling, was I should have gone through with it. Probably would have been mine. But anyway.
Yeah.
Is there anything Britain could be doing better to counter the threat from Russia, do you think?
Well, I think, and I want to be very fair, you know, I think we've done the right things in Ukraine. I think we have, you know, we stood up early and you know, and credit to the people involved, including Boris Johnson, whatever else people might think of him. I think on Ukraine he did the right things. I think we still have a way to go in making our kind of political and financial structures much more resilient. It seems to be it's pretty easy for money to slip into the political system, and that money could be coming from anywhere. It seems to me it's quite easy to use, whether it's the sort of London property market or the City of London, things like that, to launder stolen money. And of course, that's not just about Russia. That could be kleptocrat money from anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that it doesn't feel like the structures of the British state really work very well to deal with those challenges.
Yeah. So it's something worth looking at. And I forgot to ask you, what are your thoughts on what's motivating Putin in a way and acting in the way he is?
Well,
quite a big question, that one.
Yeah, big question. I mean, I mean, first thing I wouldn't class myself as a sort of expert on him and his activities, but it feels as if he has this incredible level of resentment.
Yeah.
And it's odd because it's not. I don't think he's nostalgic for the Soviet Union per se, and you know that he's. If you look at the way he's not particularly a high sort of doesn't have a particularly high opinion of Lenin, for example. But he looks to Stalin and Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, and again Stalin because of the sort of power that he exercised on the world stage. So I think he has this obsession with Russia being seen as a great country and not being humiliated, not being sort of chaotic and slightly kind of, you know, in the 1990s there was a period when you associated Russia with sort of chaotic, sclerotic, you know, bad technology, bad food, bad, you know, and I suppose that is a humiliation. But the problem is that what he's doing is you know, it's the last great European empire, and he won't let it go. And you know, Europe is full of countries, including Britain and France and Spain, all of which had huge empires at one point. And I'm not saying that any of these countries are perfect in terms of getting over that. We all have our imperial hang-ups. But Russia is still actually trying to control an empire, and that feels very different.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you for that. I suppose they're going to go into sort of spy rings and recruiting students. So you've talked already about your influence on from the Cambridge Five, but there's been some interesting sort of stories of recently and historically about intelligence services and even terrorist groups sort of targeting students for recruitment, like the Cambridge Five. And I was wondering how real that sort of threat is to students today of potentially being recruited by a hostile power or terrorist organization.
Yeah, I think there have been some case studies involving China as well, and obviously, yes, certainly people's sort of radicalization. I think the thing we all know is that young people, and of course, this is one of the great things about being at university, you're there to explore new ideas. Yeah. You're at an impressionable point in your life. You're willing to entertain a measure of risk. I don't necessarily mean physical risk, but just, you know, try things that feel a little bit adventurous and different. And so obviously you can see how that can be exploited by sort of nefarious actors. And I think for a period of time, probably our focus was more on the risk from a kind of radicalization, sort of militant organizations, whether it was, you know, Islamist or some other type of potentially dangerous ideology. But clearly that's something that intelligence agents can also use. And as part of that, there's the uncertainty. Young people have a lot of uncertainty, whether it's economic uncertainty, whether it's social uncertainty about what they're going to be in their later life, and you if you can exploit someone by offering them a sense of potentiality and certainty, you can see how that would be quite fruitful.
Yeah, definitely. And I think especially when you're young as well, because there is a lot of uncertainty about a lot of things, especially at the moment, it feels like with global warming coming or
Right.
employment prospects, they're two very
Yeah.
big things there that
Yeah.
certainly, one would crave some sort of certainty in that. Well, thank you for talking about the real world influences. I'd love to just chat a little bit about your literary influences if you've
Yeah.
got time there. Are there any obvious sort of literary influences on you that influenced you as a writer?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think, within the spy genre, I think anybody writing these books is probably in some way under the shadow of John le Carre. I'm a huge admirer of his work. I don't for a moment think anything I write's getting close to it, but he's the way that he wrote about a sort of slightly dark, slightly cynical world, a world which is not full of heroes and sort of macho, the James Bond type, but these sort of intellectual but flawed characters, people whose lives feel quite unsatisfactory, but grappling with the real world with all its flaws. So I think that had a big influence on me. I've enjoyed other sort of classic spy writers. So, just reading off some, John Buchan back in the day, you've got, Eric Ambler, Len Deighton. Those are all writers who've meant a lot to me. But I definitely, as a writer, I think I've been very influenced just by great literature that I've encountered throughout my life. I love Dickens. I like sort of writers who play with the reader in that kind of unreliable narrator sort of thing. And I think that again, spy literature is about layers being peeled away, and the reader not at the start of the book, shouldn't know all the information. And so any book that does that is sort of playful with the reader, I certainly is something that appeals to me.
Yeah. Putting you on the spot, do you have a favourite spy novel?
That's a very good question. If I did, it might actually be, believe it or not, The Honourable School by John le Carre, which is obviously the middle of his great trilogy of the Charle trilogy. And I think a lot of people find it less satisfactory. It's very long, and it doesn't really involve Russians. Not that that's essential at all. But I love the sort of complexity of it, and the twists and the turns, and the depiction, because it's a sort of Vietnam War novel in a way. The depiction of the kind of steamy horror of Southeast Asia at that time, but also the depiction of Hong Kong under a very sort of British colonial period of the 70s and so on. So that's a great. Probably, if it's not that one, it's another one which I'm very fond of. Again, another le Carre is The Looking Glass War, which isn't always seen as his best work. I think apparently people didn't like it when it came out, but it's sort of a bit like The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, but with an even sort of darker side to it. And I think it's just brilliantly sort of cynical and in its own way, there's sort of a horrible realism to it.
No, good choices there. Are there any films or TV shows that have caught your eye? And have any films or TV shows kind of caught life at MI6 accurately yet? It might not even be a spy show. Is there another show that makes it feel like life at MI6?
Well, certainly films that I've seen which have caught my eye, which definitely aren't about MI6 because they're American. Spy Game.
Oh yeah.
Robert Redford, Brad Pitt. I think it's a great film, and it's a great film on every level. But the depiction of we were talking about it earlier, the relationship between an agent and a case officer, a source and a handler, however you want to describe it, I think it's brilliantly done. I think it's really good. TV shows, obviously the current Slow Horses is wonderful. I mean, it's incredibly funny and sort of clever and cynical. In terms of depiction of sort of British intelligence and particularly the sort of MI6, funnily enough, I'm not aware of maybe that's a sort of gap in the market. I'm not aware of any particularly good ones. I mean, I think you've tended to have either shows like Spooks, which are great, but they're quite sort of action oriented.
Yeah.
Or the sort of high glamour stuff, which is, I mean, and at one extreme you obviously have James Bond, which is fun to watch, but pure fiction, 100% fiction. So unless I'm sort of missing a really obvious one, I can't think of any. I mean, the classic BBC John le Carre, so he does Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. I think that's a brilliant depiction. It's certainly a fictional world, but a sort of an authentic fiction. But it's very of its time, you know.
Yeah.
It's very much a sort of 1970s, early 80s. I can't think of anything that's particularly sort of up to date, actually.
No. There's one show I've always liked, but I have no idea how accurate it is. Some people say it is. It's a TV show called The Sandbaggers that was made by Yorkshire Television in the late 70s. I don't know if you've seen that one.
No, I've not. I think I have heard of it. I should take a look at it. There's a writer called Alan Judd.
Oh, that name rings a bell. Yeah.
Who's written some very good spy fiction. Who you know has an intelligence background, and I think one of his has been made into a film or a TV show, and that's pretty good. Another one that's great, not depicting British, but feels pretty bang on, is Tehran, which depicts Israeli spies operating undercover in Iran. I think it's brilliantly done. And of course, you know, whether it's true to life or not, I don't know. But what we do know, because there's been lots of interesting reports, is that the Israelis have done a series of very remarkable operations in Iran targeting the nuclear scientists, including a series of assassinations, which of course morally very, very complex, but very, very interesting and fascinating.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. I'd love to talk to you a bit about how you went about writing your book, and did you write it part-time around other work, or did you have do you have a routine or ritual that you follow?
Yeah, well, it's although it's just come out, I wrote it mostly a couple of years back at the sort of start of that lockdown period, so a period of enforced idleness, and I had a sort of idea to write a novel. I think, like lots of people, I've always sort of toyed with the idea. But that point of enforced idleness sort of pushed me to get going. And the other thing that slightly inspired me was actually the death of John le Carre, because I felt that he'd had such a sort of influence on me just as a reader. And I thought, well, if I'm ever going to do something, you know, it just sort of spurred me into action a bit. And I wouldn't want the listener to think I'm sort of comparing myself to him, but just that you know, it's a classic case of sort of you could spend your life talking about a thing you're planning to do and not doing it. So I just had to get moving, and it was that moment that just sort of flipped a switch somewhere inside me.
Yeah, usually it's something that will do it. I mean, is there any advice you would give to authors who have yet to get their work sort of published, or even the confidence to get started?
Yeah, well, certainly on the confidence to get started, I think there is this there's a metaphor of you know, sort of building a high building that obviously one layer of bricks, you know, may only be, you know, 10 centimeters high, but obviously that's how buildings are built, and many are still built by hand laid bricks, and so you know you do just have to believe in yourself, and it's that thing that, for example, if you can write 1,000 words, in a day, or maybe in an evening after work, if you're really going well. Then actually, when you start, you know, a novel probably is at a minimum probably 75,000, usually a bit more. But actually, if you think about it that way, that's not that hard. You know, I'm not going to, you know, because clearly you have to have the idea, you've got to have the plot in your mind in some way. Some people are different; they have it all laid out. Others, you know, go as they go along. But so I think that's one thing. Is you've the hardest bit, I think, is the first few words, because it's really difficult to sort of believe that you can do this. But it's really worth it. In terms of getting published, I mean, that is very difficult these days. But I certainly think you have to have an agent. I think and in my advice to someone would be actually probably write a small bit of a book and be really, really happy with it, and then try and find an agent. Because it depends on, some people may feel, I just want to write my book and I'll be proud of it, whatever I do, and that's great, and I totally respect that. But if you're struggling a bit with the sort of self-belief and the motivation, if you've got some good chapters, most agents will be willing to read, let's say 3, 4, 5 chapters. I mean, a lot of them will tell you on their websites what they do and don't accept. But if they like it, they'll tell you that, and that's actually a huge validation, because there's someone whose job it is to read fiction that could be published and telling you that yours is worth doing and carrying on with it. So I think that's a really that certainly worked for me really well.
Yeah, it's good advice. And I'm assuming if they do take interest, they don't turn around so they say, "Where's the rest of the book?" They
well, right. I mean, obviously you need to be straight up with someone.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think the point is, if someone sees a fragment, but a decent fragment, say 10,000 words or something, and thinks, well, this is, and you can lay out the synopsis of the plot as well, and they feel, and the agent thinks, well, this reads well, I enjoyed this, I want to know more. I mean, that's ultimately what it is. That's what a writer has to offer to the reader. And of course, the other thing is to think about, publishers are businesses. They have to sell something. So what is it you're selling? It may be that you need to think a bit about what the world is into at the moment. Is it AI? Can you create a espionage novel around AI? If you write an espionage novel about a British spy who's a bit like Kim Philby in the Cold War, the publisher might say, well, okay, but there are a lot of these books already, and it's quite hard because no one knows you to publish your book. And that can be quite cutting, because your book might be brilliant. But so sometimes I think you've got to think quite commercially. If you're very keen to be published, think about what it is the world is interested in at the moment.
Yeah, brilliant. Another question away from writing, but if a listener is interested in a career in British intelligence, what would you recommend them to do?
Well, actually, these days, it's quite straightforward. You go on the website and you can read about the recruitment process. You can start your application online, and you can, if you're somebody that has the right skills and qualifications, you have a good chance of getting in. The one thing I would say, there's not much I can say about that time, but you do not need to have gone to a private school or have an uncle who's there or a godparent or anything of that kind of stuff. They are organisations that they need diversity, and not because it's a desirable political objective, but by definition, to be able to operate, you've got to be like the population, because you have to be among the population. So I think these are organisations that have a pretty straightforward and fair recruitment process. Obviously, it's demanding, and not everyone will get in, but it's basically, if it's something you're interested in, take a look and educate yourself about the requirements.
Yeah. And is there any advantage to like studying a foreign language or doing international studies or anything like that? Are there any students out there? Or...
I think certainly having language skills is advantageous, particularly, again, if you're a fluent Russian speaker, I don't think it would be surprising if someone, that, or Ukrainian or whatever, there are clearly certain languages that will be advantageous. I think, yes, having done interesting things overseas, I don't mean it, some kind of spy type stuff, but just having a broad range of international experiences could be helpful. But it's helpful more like it would be in any job, that if you can demonstrate to a recruiter that you've done something in a demanding setting, perhaps where you had to think on your feet, you can imagine that's a classic job interview question, isn't it? And I think it's as much about that. It's not that, I'm connected to the Minister of Defence in Saudi Arabia or something, it's more about, can you show someone that you are somebody who's resourceful, and you've got a certain resilience and certain other attributes that you could imagine would be useful in that environment.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Where can listeners find out more about you and your excellent book?
Well, the book is widely available. It's published by Canelo, and obviously you'll find it on their website. You'll find it in Warston's, on Amazon, and all the other good bookshops, independent bookshops also. I'm on Twitter at CB20226, but just put Charles Beaumont Writer on Twitter, you'll find me there. And I am currently trying to write a sequel to A Spy Alone, so if people enjoy A Spy Alone, hopefully they'll get another one to take a look at fairly soon.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Charles.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.